Richard Patterson was a quiet man. The kind neighbors barely noticed, but his silence masked a horrifying truth. Emily, his wife, hadn't been seen in months, and their children had vanished from the streets of Brookdale without a word. The walls of their suburban home, Richard had built something far more terrifying than anyone could imagine. A secret world of control, torment, and unspeakable cruelty. What began as a routine welfare check quickly spiraled into one of the most disturbing discoveries in modern true crime history. It began like any other autumn in the quiet town of Brookdale. The leaves had turned burnt orange and deep red carpeting the sidewalks as the wind swept gently through the streets. Life moved slowly in this small community. Everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever truly changed. That's why when the Patterson children stopped showing up at school, people noticed. At first, it was subtle. A missed day here or there. Then a week passed, and no one had seen the kids. Not in school, not in the yard. Not even at the local grocery store where they usually tagged along with their mother. Their neighbor, Mrs. Klein, lived directly across the street and had always kept an eye on the Patterson family. She had noticed the mail piling up in their box. Packages sat untouched on the porch. The kids' bikes leaned against the garage unmoved. She hadn't seen Richard Patterson, the father, in days, but that didn't strike her as strange. He was quiet, kept to himself. But it was the silence that finally made her uneasy. No laughter, no music, not even the usual sound of the family dog barking. Mrs. Klein tried knocking on the door one afternoon. She waited, listening carefully. Nothing. She knocked again, louder this time, then circled the house. The curtains were all drawn, not a single light was on. She called out, hoping maybe one of the children would peek through the blinds. Still silence. When she returned home, her unease didn't fade. She sat by the window all evening, glancing every few minutes at the dark house across the street. By morning, she decided to call the police. She told the dispatcher that something was wrong. She didn't know what exactly, just that the house felt ... off. 2 officers arrived later. That afternoon, they knocked and waited, called out, and knocked again. No response. They walked the perimeter, noting the overgrown lawn and the heavy locks on the doors. One officer bent down to inspect the mail pile, flipping through letters and official looking. Notices that had clearly gone unopened for weeks. Then came the smell, faint but undeniable. One of the officers picked it up first, a metallic sour odor that seemed to drift from the vents along the side of the house. It was subtle enough that someone might dismiss it as a dead animal under the porch. But this wasn't an ordinary smell. It was the kind that made your stomach twist. Even if you didn't know why, the officers tried looking through a side window. But the glass had been covered from the inside with cardboard and duct tape. At this point, they had enough reason to request a welfare check warrant. Something was definitely wrong. Still, no one could have imagined what they were about to uncover to anyone passing by. The Patterson house looked like any other, but behind those walls, something sinister was waiting, something no one in Brookdale was prepared to face. The next morning, officers returned with a signed warrant in hand. The sun was just rising, casting a pale light over Maplewood Lane, but the Patterson house remained dark and still. With careful steps and quiet urgency, the police approached the front door. They called out one final time before using a crowbar. To force it open, the moment they stepped inside, the temperature dropped. It wasn't just cold, it was unnaturally frigid, like the air itself had been drained of warmth. The hallway was narrow and dim, lined with faded wallpaper and old family photos. Dust hung in the air. There was no sound except the creaking of the floorboards beneath their boots. The living room looked abandoned. Furniture was intact but coated in a layer of dust. A cracked television screen sat in the corner unplugged. Toys were scattered. Across the rug, as if someone had been playing and was suddenly interrupted. The dining table had plates still sitting on it, molded food crusted to the edges. A rotten smell rose from the kitchen sink, where dishes were stacked high, some with dried bits of what looked like cereal, others swimming in cloudy sour water. What disturbed the officers most wasn't what they saw, but what they didn't see. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of forced entry, but there was an overwhelming sense that something had gone very wrong here. As they moved deeper into the house, they found more unsettling clues. In the master bedroom, the bed was made perfectly neat, but the closet was nearly empty only. Men's clothes hung inside. The dresser drawers had been cleared of women's belongings. No makeup, no jewelry, no scent of perfume. Just a few photos on the nightstand of the family, Richard Patterson, his wife Emily, and their 3 children. In every photo, Emily smiled. But in the most recent one, her eyes looked tired. In each of the children's bedrooms, the beds were unmade. Clothes were strewn about as if they had been left in a hurry. A half-packed backpack sat in the corner of the youngest child's room, filled with coloring books and a juice box long expired. It was when the officers reached the basement that everything shifted. The door was locked with a heavy chain. Behind it, something scraped faintly, like metal brushing against stone. One officer called for bolt cutters, while the other checked for signs of recent movement. When the lock snapped open and the door creaked wide, the smell intensified. A sharp, coppery scent that clung to the air. The stairs led down into total darkness. Flashlights revealed concrete walls and a dirt floor. In one corner sat an old furnace, another a pile of discarded clothing. But what caught their attention most was a wall lined with soundproof foam, poorly installed, as if someone had done it themselves. Behind the foam was another door, this one even more crudely concealed. They forced it open. What lay beyond it would shake even the most seasoned officers to their core. The hidden room behind the foam-padded wall was small and suffocating. With no windows and only a single dim overhead bulb casting a sickly yellow light. The walls were bare concrete, stained and chipped, and the air felt heavy thick with the stench of mold, metal, and something far worse. Chains hung from rusted hooks, their ends dragging along the floor. A thin mattress lay in the corner, stained and torn, with leather restraints bolted to its sides. This was not a storage space. It was something else entirely. Lining one wall was a makeshift desk, cluttered with notebooks, old photos, and stacks of cassette tapes. A tape recorder sat at the center, its buttons worn from frequent use. One officer opened a drawer and found dozens of labeled tapes, each with a date and a number. Another discovered a stack of journals, each filled with neat, obsessive handwriting. The journals belonged to Richard Patterson. What they revealed painted a picture of a man slipping deeper into darkness, page by page. The early entries were dull, almost mundane complaints about work, the children, and how his wife didn't respect him, but soon the tone shifted. He began writing about punishment, about silence, about the sins his family had committed. He described feeling watched, judged, and disrespected within his own home. He wrote about needing to correct the behavior of his wife and children. There were chilling entries that spoke of cleansing through isolation and discipline through silence. One line, scribbled in angry, uneven ink, simply read, "She wouldn't stop screaming, so I made her stop." Further entries detailed how he gradually began keeping his family in different parts of the house, locked away for reflection. He wrote with satisfaction about taking control. There was no sign of regret, only pride. One entry mentioned a date almost a year earlier, marked with the words, "The Day of Peace." Gators began to believe this might be when Emily Patterson was killed. Other entries hinted that he had planned it for months, carefully manipulating those around him to appear normal. A second, smaller room was found connected to the chamber, sealed off with a thick curtain. Inside were more disturbing signs. Small shoes lined up along the wall, plastic bowls stacked on the floor, and a bucket in the corner that served as a toilet. There were faded drawings on the concrete, childlike scribbles of houses, trees, and stick figures. It was now clear that at least some of the Patterson children had been kept here. The extent of their captivity remained unknown, but the setup suggested prolonged imprisonment. It was now clear that at least some of the Patterson children had been kept here. The extent of their captivity remained unknown, but the setup suggested prolonged imprisonment. As officers continued documenting the space, one investigator stood, in stunned silence, holding a photo found under the mattress. It showed Emily Patterson bruised and pale, eyes vacant. The date on the back matched the day of peace. Whatever secrets this house had buried, they were no longer hidden. Richard Patterson hadn't just isolated his family, he had turned his home into a prison. And now, the full horror of what happened inside was finally beginning to surface. With the discovery of Emily Patterson's photograph and the journals confirming her likely murder, the investigation shifted into overdrive. Forensic teams were called in immediately, and a perimeter was established around the property. The home, once just another house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, was now a crime scene of unimaginable darkness. But amid the growing horror, one question loomed largest: where were the Patterson children? Detectives combed through every inch of the house for any signs of life, but the main structure offered nothing beyond the grim evidence already uncovered. Cadaver dogs were brought in to sweep the property, moving through the basement, attic, and yard with trained precision. In the attic, they found something unusual. Beneath a section of disturbed insulation was a hidden crawl space. It was just large enough for a child to fit inside. The floor was covered in crumbs and wrappers, and there was a small stack of worn blankets balled up in the corner. A single flashlight out of batteries lay nearby. It appeared that at least one of the children had been hiding there recently. Investigators noted scratch marks on the inside of the attic entrance, as if someone had clawed to open it from the inside. But there was no one there now. Officers expanded their search to the surrounding neighborhood, knocking on doors and reviewing any available security footage from nearby homes. One homeowner, 3 houses down, had a camera facing the rear alley. When reviewed, the footage showed something remarkable. 2 days prior to the welfare check, in the early morning hours, 3 small figures had slipped through the backyard and disappeared into the nearby woods. Search units were immediately deployed to the forested area behind the Patterson home. It was a dense patch of woods, rarely visited, with overgrown trails and crumbling old sheds from decades past. As the sun began to set, officers spread out with dogs and floodlights, calling out into the trees. Hours passed. The cold deepened. Just when it seemed like another day would end without answers, one of the dogs alerted near a collapsed structure, half buried in undergrowth. Officers carefully approached and pushed open the rotting door. Inside, huddled beneath a pile of blankets and tarp, were 3 children, pale, wide-eyed. The oldest, a boy of about 12, shielded his siblings instinctively. The younger 2, a boy and a girl, clung to him. They were weak but alive. Paramedics were called immediately. The children had been surviving on canned food they had stolen from the house and rainwater collected in an old bucket. The oldest child later told authorities they had escaped the house the night before the police arrived. He had heard noises upstairs and feared their father had discovered their hiding spot. He led his siblings out through the basement vent and into the woods. Terrified but determined to protect them, they had waited, hoping someone would come. And finally, someone did. The nightmare was over, but the road to recovery had only just begun. Richard Patterson was arrested without incident that same evening. He had returned home while officers were still processing the scene, as if nothing had happened. He parked his car, walked calmly toward the house, and barely reacted when police swarmed him. He didn't ask why, didn't resist. When handcuffed and placed into the back of a squad car, he looked straight ahead, his expression blank, not confused, not scared. Just ... empty. As news of the arrest broke, Brookdale erupted in disbelief. Neighbors who had once waved to Richard from across their lawns now stood in silence behind police tape, watching as evidence bags were carried out one by one. Reporters began arriving within hours, and soon the Patterson house was a national headline. The media labeled it the House of Horror, and for good reason. During his interrogation, Richard showed no emotion. He didn't deny what had happened. In fact, he barely spoke at all. When investigators confronted him with the journals, the tapes, and the photographs, he simply said, "I did what I had to do." He offered no further explanation. No apologies, nothing about his children, nothing about his wife. A psychological evaluation later revealed that Richard had long shown signs of narcissistic personality disorder and delusional thinking. He believed he had a divine purpose to cleanse his family, that he was protecting them from outside evil by punishing what he saw as weakness and disobedience. Experts called it one of the most extreme cases of familial control and delusion ever documented. Meanwhile, the children were placed in protective custody and underwent immediate medical treatment. They were malnourished, dehydrated, and emotionally shattered. The oldest child, despite his age, had become something of a parental figure to his younger siblings. He was the one who made the decision to flee, who scavenged food from the kitchen when it was safe, and who whispered bedtime stories. To calm them in the darkness of the attic, the community rallied around them. Local organizations set up donation drives, and volunteers offered counseling, housing, and support. But trauma like theirs doesn't fade easily. The children rarely spoke about what had happened. In therapy sessions, they drew pictures instead dark, haunting images of locked rooms, crying faces, and empty eyes. A year later, the trial of Richard Patterson began. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: journal entries, videotapes from inside the basement, forensic analysis, and witness testimonies. The defense claimed mental illness, but the jury needed only 2 hours to reach a verdict. Richard Patterson was found guilty on all counts, including the murder of his wife, unlawful imprisonment, and multiple counts of child abuse. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no reaction as the sentence was read. No remorse, no emotion, just the same blank stare he'd worn from the moment he was arrested. The house on Maplewood Lane was eventually demolished. The lot remains empty to this day. Overgrown grass and wildflowers now cover the foundation, as if nature itself is trying to erase what once stood there. But in the minds of those who remember, the scars will never fade.